Gavin Newsom walked into the White House East Room that afternoon carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had spent years turning cameras into allies. Yet within minutes, the entire room would witness something no polished podcast or carefully rehearsed interview had prepared him for. As someone who has spent decades in politics and now has the privilege of walking viewers through these moments on television, I want to take you inside that meeting and show you exactly how a routine gathering of governors became a defining confrontation. The usual National Governors Association sessions at the White House follow a familiar, almost ritualistic pattern. Presidents speak about cooperation. Governors nod at the right moments. Everyone lines up for the photograph in front of the flags, and by the time the motorcades pull away, most participants can barely recall a single substantive sentence. Those meetings are designed to project importance without creating real risk, to suggest bipartisan coordination while carefully avoiding the messy realities of political failures, budget shortfalls, or public frustration waiting outside the polished doors. This meeting was different from the first moment the 50 governors entered. C-SPAN cameras were live. President Trump stood behind the podium. Gavin Newsom sat in the third row, positioned between the governors of Nevada and Oregon, his posture suggesting he believed he could manage whatever exchange might arise. His advisors had reportedly urged him to stay away. A sitting president whose Justice Department was examining people connected to his political world represented obvious exposure with little obvious upside. Yet Newsom has never treated a camera as a threat. Throughout his career in San Francisco politics, California state government, recall battles, national television appearances, and his own podcast, the presence of a lens has consistently been an opportunity. His instinct has always been to step forward, trusting that presentation, rhythm, and composure would carry him through difficult questions. That instinct had served him well for years. This time the calculation would prove far more costly because the room was not managed by his staff, the questions were not coming from a friendly interviewer, and there would be no editing room afterward to soften the rough edges. President Trump began with standard remarks about the economy, infrastructure, and wildfire funding, the familiar language any president uses when addressing governors from both parties. The room had every reason to expect another largely ceremonial exchange. Then Trump turned to his right, looked directly toward the third row, and said, "Governor Newsom, while we're all here, I think the American people deserve an update on what's happening in California." Newsom did not wait for the sentence to land or for an actual question to form. He rose from his chair and delivered the defense he had been rehearsing publicly for weeks. Mr. President, what is happening in California is that your Department of Justice is conducting a politically motivated investigation against me, my wife, and my family. I came here in good faith to discuss wildfire preparedness. Instead, you are using the full power of the federal government as a political weapon. The people of California did not send me here to be ambushed. The language was crisp, the accusation familiar. It transformed an investigation into a persecution story, shifting attention away from evidence and onto the identity of the alleged persecutor. Newsom had made this same argument repeatedly on his podcast, on CNN, on MSNBC, and in any setting where a camera allowed him to present himself as the target of a president supposedly weaponizing federal power against a future rival. President Trump did not interrupt. He did not raise his voice. He rested both hands on the edges of the podium and nodded once, slowly allowing Newsom to complete every sentence. In a room where every word was being recorded for the permanent public record, letting an opponent finish can be more powerful than cutting him off. A man still speaking can adjust course or soften a claim. A man who has finished has placed his entire argument on the table for examination. Only after Newsom sat down did Trump respond. The smile appeared first. "Beautiful speech, Governor. Very smooth. You should do another podcast episode about it. That was really good." To those unfamiliar with Trump's style, the words might have sounded almost complimentary. Anyone who has watched him in these settings understands that smooth in this context rarely means praise. It signals that the sales pitch has been heard and the contents of the box are now about to be inspected. The smile vanished almost immediately. The tone shifted. "But since you brought up California, Governor, let's talk about California. Let's talk about who is leaving and why. Trump placed a single number in the center of the room. 240,000 people had left California in the previous year. Not tourists ending vacations, not seasonal workers completing contracts. Families with jobs, mortgages, children in school, neighborhoods, routines, and entire lives that had to be packed into vehicles and moved somewhere else. Then came the comparison so simple, no policy paper was required to understand it. The cost of renting a one-way U-Haul from Los Angeles to Houston stood at $3,500. The cost of renting the same truck from Houston to Los Angeles was $900. Same truck, same distance, same company. The only difference was direction. Everyone was moving one way, and it was not toward California. That figure was not an abstract argument about tax policy or regulatory philosophy. It was a market signal ordinary families could grasp instantly. Prices move when demand moves. When far more people are trying to rent trucks in one direction than the other, the imbalance becomes visible before any politician can explain it away. A $3,500 one-way rental is not a weekend experiment. It represents a household deciding that the cost, disruption, fear, and uncertainty of leaving are preferable to the cost of staying. It means selling or abandoning the house where children grew up, pulling those children from schools, leaving churches, neighbors, jobs, local businesses, doctors, family routines, and familiar streets, then driving across hundreds or thousands of miles because another state appears to offer something their current government no longer provides. 240,000 people made some version of that calculation in a single year. Each departure became harder to dismiss when placed beside a governor insisting that criticism of his administration was merely partisan hostility. Trump then turned from the people leaving California to the political circle surrounding the governor. The confrontation moved from migration statistics into something far more damaging. Dana Williamson, Governor, your chief of staff. 23 federal counts, pleaded guilty last month, $225,000 stolen from Xavier Becerra's campaign account, $1.7 million in fake business expenses, private jet travel, Governor. Luxury vacations, all of it filed under official business. The force of the attack did not come from volume. It came from the sequence of numbers, names, charges, and expenses, each placed directly against the image of ordinary Californians being told to accept higher costs, tighter budgets, and deteriorating public services. The contrast was deliberate. While families were calculating whether they could afford the truck needed to leave the state, someone from the governor's inner circle was being described as charging luxury travel and private jets as business expenses. Your chief of staff was flying private while your voters were packing U-Hauls. Newsom answered the way he had answered before, smooth, controlled, visibly prepared. Dana Williamson left my office before any charges were filed. Her conduct predated her tenure with my administration. I referred the matter to authorities the moment I became aware. This is guilt by association, Mr. President, and frankly, it is beneath this forum. The answer sounded reasonable because it had been designed to sound reasonable. Every word had been placed carefully enough to separate the governor from the conduct without forcing him to defend the conduct itself. It was also familiar, almost mechanically familiar, because the same language, the same rhythm, and the same slight pause before beneath this forum had already appeared in Newsom's public defenses on television, on his podcast, and in statements issued after the guilty plea. That is what a disciplined political operation does when facts become dangerous. It does not improvise, it repeats. The discussion did not stop there. Trump lowered his voice and asked, "Governor, let me ask you something. How many people in your political circle received letters from the FBI last fall informing them that their phone calls had been recorded?" Newsom stiffened. "I am not going to discuss the specifics of an ongoing federal investigation in this forum, Mr. President." The answer was technically cautious and legally predictable, yet politically useless. Refusing to provide a number only created more room for the number Trump was already prepared to supply. 37, Governor, 37 people. Lobbyists, insiders, political operatives, campaign consultants, all in Sacramento, all in your orbit. Every one of them received a letter from the FBI informing them that their phone calls had been intercepted during the course of an active investigation. The argument was now brutally simple. This was no longer a single employee who allegedly went off the rails. 37 people connected to the same political environment created a pattern too large to bury under the phrase guilt by association. That is not one rogue staffer, Governor. That is not guilt by association. When 37 people in one political orbit have their phones tapped by the FBI, that is not a coincidence. That is a circle, and circles have a center. The atmosphere in the East Room changed. Everyone there understood that a narrow investigation can be contained more easily than a sprawling one. Newsom had spent weeks presenting the entire matter as a partisan attack from Trump, rather than explaining why federal scrutiny had spread across so many people around him. He needed to take control of the room again, and for the next 30 seconds, Newsom stood, buttoned his jacket, looked first at Trump, then toward the cameras, and delivered the strongest counterattack he had produced all afternoon. Mr. President, since we are doing this in front of cameras, let me give the American people some context that you are conveniently leaving out. California's GDP is $3.6 trillion, the fifth largest economy on earth, larger than the United Kingdom, larger than India. Last year, more people moved to California than moved to 38 other states. We lead this nation in job creation, in clean energy, in technology, in agricultural exports. He drove the political point directly at the other governors in the room. The people who leave California leave because housing costs are high, because success is expensive, not because the state is failing. The state I govern is subsidizing half the states represented in this room right now. The counterattack worked for a reason. The economic figures gave Newsom a credible foundation from which to argue that California's problems existed alongside enormous economic power, innovation, tax revenue, global influence, and industries other states would gladly claim. Several governors in that room represented states that receive more from the federal government than they contribute, and Newsom knew exactly what he was doing when he reminded them that California's tax base helps finance a national system that extends far beyond its borders. For about 15 seconds, the argument shifted toward him. Instead of defending an investigation, he had moved on to terrain where California's size and economic reach gave him numbers powerful enough to change the subject. Then Trump said two words quietly and without any theatrical buildup: June 2024. That date did more damage than another accusation could have done because Newsom's public narrative depended on a timeline, and timelines do not care how confidently a talking point has been repeated, Trump continued. You keep telling the cameras that I started this investigation. You said it on your podcast. You said it on CNN. You said it to Anderson Cooper's face. You said it 30 seconds ago in this room. He then asked the question that forced the entire persecution narrative onto one narrow factual point. Governor, when do you think this investigation actually started? Newsom did not answer. Trump supplied the date again, not as a slogan, but as the factual hinge on which the entire afternoon now turned. June 2024. Joe Biden was president. Merrick Garland was attorney general. Your party controlled the White House. Your party ran the DOJ, your administration, your people. They opened this case. Not me, not my attorney general. Joe Biden's FBI in June of 2024. The significance was immediate. Newsom had spent weeks telling audiences that Trump was using federal power against him, yet the inquiry Trump was now describing had begun before Trump controlled the Justice Department and before the central villain in Newsom's story had the authority to start the case. That did not answer every possible question about how the investigation later developed, but it destroyed the easiest version of the claim that the investigation itself had been created by Trump as political revenge. Newsom's lawyers would have known the date. His press operation would have known the date. Anyone responsible for managing the political response to a federal investigation would have understood when the inquiry began. Yet Trump is persecuting me was a cleaner message than an investigation involving people in my political orbit began while a Democratic administration controlled the Justice Department. Trump was not finished. And there is one more thing you should know, Governor. One more thing the American people should know. His voice dropped again before he introduced the name that widened the problem beyond dates, public statements, and competing interpretations of when the investigation began. Alexis Podesta, a Democrat, a member of your political circle. She has been wearing a wire for the FBI since June 2024, recording conversations with people in your orbit, with lobbyists, with insiders for 2 years. Not because I asked her to, because Joe Biden's FBI asked her to, and she said yes. A Democratic insider wearing a wire under a Democratic administration did not fit the story Newsom had spent weeks selling. Trump turned from Newsom toward the rest of the room. When your own people agree to wear the wire, Governor, that tells you something. It tells you they already knew what was happening inside that circle. They knew before I did. Newsom stood again. This time, the change was visible, not in the content of his defense, but in the way it came out. Faster, tighter, and without the smooth rhythm that had carried the earlier answers. The Podesta matter is connected to the Williamson case, not to me directly. Even if the timeline shows that the initial inquiry began under the previous administration, your DOJ made the decision to expand the scope. You could have closed it. You chose not to. That is a political calculation, Mr. President. The defense had shifted in real time, and that shift mattered. Only minutes earlier, the accusation had been that Trump's Justice Department was conducting a politically motivated investigation against him, his wife, and his family. Now, confronted with the claim that the inquiry began under Biden, the argument was no longer that Trump had created the investigation, but that he had failed to stop it. That is not a minor adjustment in wording. It is a retreat from one allegation into another, and everyone in the room could hear the difference. Trump did not raise his voice because by then there was no reason to, and the slower he spoke, the more obvious the contrast became between Newsom's accelerating defense and the response coming from the podium. I did not expand anything, Governor. Grand juries did. Your own people testified. Your own chief of staff pleaded guilty to 23 federal counts. I did not pick the witnesses. I did not write the subpoenas. I did not tell Alexis Podesta to wear that wire. Then came the pause, brief enough that nobody could mistake it for hesitation, long enough that everyone in the East Room understood the next sentence was the one Trump had been working toward. I just did not shut it down the way you were hoping I would. That line cut through the entire argument because it reduced the dispute to a brutal distinction between initiating an investigation and refusing to interfere with one already underway. Newsom had arrived accusing Trump of abusing the Justice Department for political revenge. Trump's response was that the governor was angry not because the investigation had been invented, but because it had been allowed to continue. Trump stepped out from behind the podium slowly and looked at Newsom, then toward the cameras, then back at Newsom again. Governor, you asked me why I brought this up today. You said it was political. You said I was weaponizing the DOJ. You said I was trying to stop you from running for president. He was not adding anything new. He was forcing the room to remember exactly where the confrontation had started. Then his voice became quieter because at that point, volume would only have weakened the point. I am not trying to stop you from anything. I am telling you why 240,000 people a year stop living in your state. Your chief of staff stole from the taxpayer. Your circle got wiretapped by the FBI. Your own insider wore the wire for 2 years. And your voters looked at all of it and packed a truck. The argument had now completed the circle from the opening discussion of migration to the investigation Newsom had tried to frame as political revenge. Trump was no longer treating the federal case as a separate Washington scandal. He was using it as evidence inside a broader indictment of political leadership, public trust, and the widening distance between the people who govern California and the people who decide they would rather leave it. Then came the 5 words delivered in the same flat final tone used when a negotiation is over and nothing useful remains to be added. That's why they left. Newsom opened his mouth and began, "The people of California," and stopped. He tried again and the sentence still did not come. For the first time that afternoon, the polished cadence that had carried him through years of press conferences, recall fights, interviews, campaign appearances, podcasts, and national speculation about his future simply failed to produce an answer. The microphone caught breathing instead of words, and that was more damaging than another argument. Politicians can survive almost any attack as long as they can keep talking. Talking creates alternatives, creates distractions, creates a new clip, creates another frame through which the audience can interpret the moment. Silence leaves the last completed argument standing uncontested. Newsom sat down without finishing the sentence, without producing the counterattack he had been trying to reach, and without giving the cameras a final line that could be cut into a clean response later. The governors around him looked forward not because they had suddenly become neutral observers, but because there are moments in politics when looking directly at the person who has just lost control of the room feels almost cruel. No one needed to explain what had happened because the sequence had already done the work. 23 federal counts, a guilty plea, $225,000 allegedly stolen, $1.7 million in claimed fake expenses, private jets and luxury vacations described as official business, 37 phones connected to an investigation, an insider allegedly wearing a wire for 2 years. Then came the date that Newsom's entire public argument had failed to survive, June 2024. All of it, according to the case Trump had laid out, began while Joe Biden was still president, not after Donald Trump returned to control the Justice Department. That left one final question hanging over everything Newsom had said for the previous 3 weeks. If Trump did not start the investigation, why had Newsom spent so much time telling the country that he did? That question was not going away simply because Newsom had sat down. The problem with the timeline is that once the public sees it, no amount of polished messaging can put the dates back in the dark. For weeks, the political revenge argument had been repeated as though repetition itself could substitute for chronology. But the chronology now sat in plain view. June 2024, a Democratic White House, a Democratic Attorney General. A federal investigation already moving before Trump had the power Newsom accused him of abusing. The entire defense had depended on the audience never separating the existence of the investigation from the later decisions made after the change in administration. Once those two things were separated, the original narrative became much harder to sell. That was why the silence mattered. Newsom did not merely lose a verbal exchange. He lost control of the frame he had been using to explain the investigation to the country. Once a politician loses the frame, every fact that was previously dismissed as partisan suddenly becomes harder to contain. There would be statements later, interviews later, surrogates later, carefully selected phrases about context, scope, prosecutorial discretion, and the dangerous precedent of allowing one administration to continue an inquiry that began under another. None of that could erase what had happened in the room. The confrontation had forced the governor to move from Trump started this to destroy me to Trump could have stopped it and chose not to. Those are not the same accusation, and the distinction is not academic. One describes the creation of a political weapon. The other describes a demand that an existing investigation should have been shut down. Newsom could argue about motives behind later decisions, but the cleanest and most emotionally useful version of his story had already been broken open in front of 50 governors. The man he had accused of launching the attack had answered with a date that placed the beginning of the case under Newsom's own party. And that brings the argument back to California, because the investigation was never the only thing Trump was talking about, and in the structure of the confrontation, it was never supposed to be. The federal counts, the guilty plea, the alleged stolen campaign money, the claimed fake expenses, the private travel, the intercepted communications, and the insider wearing the wire were presented as pieces of a larger question about what happens when political power becomes insulated from the people financing it. Retirees in Fresno still pay state taxes and federal taxes while trying to stretch fixed incomes that have not kept pace with the cost of living, and they do not have a private jet waiting when the grocery bill rises or the insurance premium changes. Veterans in San Diego can live in homes they bought decades ago, watch the than enough for value of the surrounding real estate explode and still look outside to see public disorder that did not exist when they first moved into the neighborhood. Working mothers in Bakersfield can watch a large share of every paycheck disappear into taxes and still wonder whether the roads will be repaired, whether the schools will improve, and whether the local hospital will have enough staff when someone in the family needs care. Those people do not experience government as a press conference, a podcast clip, or a triumphant GDP statistic. They experience it in bills, commutes, rent, insurance, taxes, school quality, public safety, and the amount left in the bank after every obligation is paid. They do not care how elegant the explanation sounds if their own lives keep getting harder while people connected to political power appear to operate under rules unavailable to everyone else. They do not need a governor to tell them that success is expensive when they are already paying for that success and increasingly wondering what exactly they are receiving in return. They do not need another speech about California's global economic rank when the practical decision in front of them is whether they can afford another year in the place where they built their lives. And when enough people answer that question by leaving, the departure itself becomes a verdict. No press office can completely rewrite. That is where the U-Haul comparison returned with even more force, because it translated an enormous political argument into something a family could see on a rental screen in less than 5 minutes. Los Angeles to Houston, Los Angeles to Phoenix, Los Angeles to Dallas, Sacramento to Reno, San Francisco to Boise. Different destinations, but the same basic direction out. The routes change. The mileage changes. The destination changes. But the argument in the script remains that the pressure is one way from the state government that keeps insisting the departures are simply the price of success. Families do not dismantle entire lives because of one television segment, one tax bill, one scandal, or one politician. But they do leave when enough burdens accumulate and when the people in charge seem incapable of recognizing what those burdens feel like outside government buildings. That is why the image of a packed truck mattered more than another page of talking points. A truck full of furniture is not rhetoric, it is a decision that has already been made. Newsom's answer had been that people leave because housing is expensive, because California is successful, because the state remains an economic giant, and because prosperity itself creates pressures that weaker states do not face. That explanation only works for so long before voters begin asking why extraordinary wealth has not produced extraordinary competence, why one of the richest governments in the country still struggles with problems that appear to worsen year after year, and why the people paying the bills are so often told that expecting better is somehow unrealistic. Economic size can demonstrate strength, but it can also sharpen the indictment when the public sees massive resources and still feels abandoned by the institutions controlling them. A state with a multi-trillion-dollar economy does not get to use complexity as an excuse forever, because the larger the resources, the harder it becomes to explain why basic systems still feel broken to the people funding them. Newsom had used California's scale as a shield. Trump had turned that same scale into a question about results. There was also the political future hanging behind the entire confrontation. Newsom had spent years being discussed as something larger than a governor, something national, something waiting beyond Sacramento. He had built the image carefully, fluent on television, combative when needed, polished enough for donors, aggressive enough for partisan audiences, and constantly positioned close enough to the presidential conversation that every major confrontation could be interpreted through the lens of what might come next. That was why the political persecution narrative was so useful. A politician who can present himself as the chosen target of the opposing president can convert investigation into stature, scrutiny into martyrdom, and legal danger into fundraising energy. But that strategy carries an obvious risk. The persecution story must survive contact with the timeline. In the East Room, according to the structure of this account, it did not. Nobody in that room needed to declare Gavin Newsom's career over, because politics rarely ends that cleanly, and powerful figures almost always find another camera, another argument, and another opportunity to recover. But for one afternoon, the image he had spent years building failed at the precise moment he needed it most. Not because he was shouted down, not because the microphones were cut, not because he was denied the chance to answer. He stood up repeatedly, made his case, used California's strongest economic figures, accused the president of political revenge, and was given every opportunity to defend the narrative he had been promoting. Then the date appeared, the timeline shifted, the defense changed, and the polished voice that had survived 2 decades of political combat stopped in the middle of a sentence. That is the image the meeting left behind, not the loudest line, not the GDP number, not even the accusation of weaponization, but a governor trying to answer and discovering that the argument he brought into the room no longer worked. 23 federal counts, a guilty plea, $225,000 allegedly stolen, $1.7 million in claimed fake expenses, private jets, luxury vacations, 37 people connected to intercepted communications, an insider allegedly wearing a wire for 2 years. Then the date, June 2024. Under Joe Biden, before Donald Trump could have started the investigation, Newsom blamed him for creating it anyway. The people loading trucks did not need access to an FBI file to know whether they trusted the government running their state. They had their own evidence in the form of bills, taxes, services, neighborhoods, schools, and the relentless calculation of whether staying still made sense. 240,000 people, according to the argument presented in that room, reached some version of the same conclusion and left. They did not need another political explanation because by the time the truck was packed, the decision had already been made, and that was the point Trump reduced to 5 words. That's why they left.